Y'all, I'm not gonna lie. Tonight's episode gives me the willies, and it makes me itchy. So, I'm just gonna warn y'all now that although the details of tonight's episode aren't over the top graphic, the nature of the subject is disturbing to say the least. And it can strike fear in your heart. Some people even have a phobia of it.
Welcome to What the Friday, an After Dark series presented by Mystery, Murder, and Magic. Listener discretion is advised.
So, what is this thing that gives me anxiety? Y'all, it's being buried alive. Now, I don't mean that I live in fear constantly of it, because I really don't think it could happen to me, but who knows? My biggest thing about it is that I'm claustrophobic, and the thought of being closed into a small space 6 feet under the ground just freaks me out. But there are those who have a legitimate phobia of being buried alive, and they live with that fear every day. That phobia is called taphophobia. Today's episode isn't about that phobia, but it's about several people who have been buried alive. Now, back on episode 6, way back in the beginning of this podcast, we talked about a story out of here in South Carolina where in the mid-1800s, a young woman named Julia Legree was buried alive because she had gotten sick and went into a coma. And when she went into that coma, they thought she was dead, so they buried her. And you got to remember, back in those days, they buried people fairly quickly because they didn't have all the embalming and preservation and everything that they do now. So they tend to, back in those days, bury people very quickly after they passed. Now, on another episode, we also talked about Octavia Smith Hatcher from Kentucky, who had also been buried alive after she had gotten sick. This was back in the late 1800s. Now, the people I'm talking about today weren't buried alive because of an illness, though. They were buried alive because they crossed paths with some pretty sick individuals. Jessica Lunsford was a happy 9-year-old girl who lived in Homosassa, Florida. She loved to sing. She loved riding with her dad on his motorcycle, and she loved to play with stuffed animals. Near the end of February 2005, Jessica's dad, Mark, discovered that his little girl was nowhere to be found when he went into her room to wake her up for school that morning. Puzzling was the fact that nothing in her room looked like it had been disturbed or was out of place. And the only thing missing from her room, other than Jessica herself, was the clothes that she had been wearing the night before and her favorite stuffed animal, which was a dolphin. Her dad searched the entire house, and he was horrified to find that the front door of their home was unlocked. Now, like any parent would do, he began to panic, and he decided to call the authorities to report that his little girl was missing. The last time anyone had seen Jessica was around 10 p.m. the night before, when her grandparents had tucked her into bed. Now, Mark and Jessica shared a home with his parents, and the night before she went missing, he had stayed at his girlfriend's house. When he came back home around 6 a.m. that following morning, that's when he discovered that Jessica was missing. Now, nearly as soon as Mark reported that she was missing, law enforcement and volunteers were searching for the little girl. Bloodhounds were brought in, officers were searching from horseback, and there were helicopters involved in the search. They weren't having any luck finding the 9-year-old. Soon the news of this missing little girl from Florida was sweeping across the United States. From the beginning of the investigations, authorities were positive that Jessica had been kidnapped, and Jessica's parents and grandparents were all ruled out as being responsible for that kidnapping. Now, when something happens, of course, when you're a parent, and especially when you're a parent and something happens with your kids, you assume the worst. Maybe it's intuition. But they just knew something wasn't right about this whole thing. Mainly because Jessica wouldn't have ran away, especially in the middle of the night, because she was afraid of the dark. She slept with a flashlight. Now, by the beginning of March, the authorities were not able to track down any usable leads, so they decided to bring in child abduction experts. Those experts focused on the quarter-mile area around Jessica's home. At the time that Jessica disappeared, there were more than 50 sex offenders living in the same zip code as Jessica and her family. Investigators looked into those sex offenders, and on March 15th, they announced that they had a person of interest. But the thing is this person of interest had disappeared from the area for about the past 2 weeks. So they decided they would announce that if this person didn't come back to the area for an interview within 48 hours, they would have no choice but to publicly release his name. Well, that person didn't come forward, didn't return, and soon the name John Evander Cowie was released. Cowie was 46 years old and lived within 2 miles of Jessica's home. And he also spent a lot of time at his half-sister's house, which was even closer to Jessica's home. I'm talking you could see Jessica's house from his half-sister's house. It was that close. He was arrested on March 17th in Georgia. Now let's talk about Cowie for a minute. He had a very long criminal record. In a 30-year time span, he had been arrested 24 times. This is somebody that shouldn't have even been out of jail. He had been in jail for everything from burglary, disorderly intoxication, DUI, and indecent exposure. Now, he was also addicted to crack cocaine. And with that addiction, it just escalated his crimes from what had been somewhat petty in the past to sexually assaulting 2 young kids. On the day following his arrest, he admitted to abducting, raping, and murdering Jessica. And later that same day, he told authorities where Jessica's body could be found. Get this, Jessica's body had been less than 200 yards from her home the entire time. She was buried in a shallow grave on that half-sister's property. In his confession, Cowie detailed what had happened the night that Jessica went missing and the following days. Around 3 a.m. that morning, he entered their home and told Jessica to not say anything. From there, he took her to his half-sister's home, where he kept her alive only so that he could rape her over and over again over the weekend. During the initial investigation, investigators had came to that home while Jessica was still alive, but they didn't enter the home to search it. Cowie was definitely a sick individual. Not only did he sexually assault her multiple times, but he kept her hidden in a closet, and he would mentally torture her by showing her news reports about her own disappearance. When he was finally finished with all of the torture, he told her to climb into a trash bag and he would take her back home. Why would she need to climb into a garbage bag to be taken back home? Well, he lied to her and said that he didn't want anybody to see him with her. So, being a little girl, a little 9-year-old girl, she believed him. and she climbed into the trash bag. Y'all, she believed him, that innocence. He took advantage of that innocence in so many ways. She thought she was going back home to the people who loved her, but he took her to a grave that he had already dug and buried that innocent little girl alive. Now, we already talked about how Jessica was afraid of the dark. So while she was alive, he kept her in a closet. And that closet was more than likely dark. He tortured her by showing her news stories about her disappearance. And then he buried that poor baby alive. She was afraid of the dark, and he sealed her up in a garbage bag and then dumped dirt on her once he put her in that grave. That sweet little soul had to lay there terrified until she took her last breath. When authorities exhumed Jessica from that makeshift grave, she was tightly clutching that favorite stuffed animal, that dolphin. And investigators also found 2 small holes that Jessica had ripped on the garbage bag in an attempt to escape. Even if Cowie hadn't confessed, or Cowie, sorry, who really cares about his name, but even if Cowie hadn't confessed, there would have been enough evidence to convict him. Jessica's DNA, sorry y'all, this bothers me so much. Jessica's DNA was found all over his bedroom. A blood stain on his bed contained Jessica's DNA, and within that blood stain was Cowie's semen. There was also fingerprints that belonged to Jessica on a pizza box that was found in the closet that he had kept her in, and on a glass table in Cowie's bedroom. Long story short, Cowie was found guilty and sentenced to death, but he'd never see that execution. He died from cancer in 2009. It's such a heartbreaking story. That poor little girl died in such a horrifying way. I can't even imagine what her last moments on earth was like. I just don't understand anybody being so cruel, but especially to a little kid. And then we have the story of a businessman named Stephen Small. Stephen was born in 1947 and came from a very affluent family. His parents owned and operated a successful media conglomerate, and he was also the great-grandson of a former Illinois governor. Stephen himself lived in Kankakee, Illinois, with his wife Nancy, and the couple had 3 sons. In the wee early morning hours of September 2nd, 1987, Stephen received a phone call. The person on the other end claimed to be a police officer, and they told him that a property that he owned had been burglarized. Stephen decided to get dressed and drive to that property. Well, he had been gone for about 3 hours. I'm sure his wife was starting to panic. 3 hours in the middle of the night, But 3 hours later, another call came in, and the caller told Stephen's wife Nancy that they had her husband, and then she could hear her husband say that he was handcuffed in a box in the ground. He instructed his wife to gather a $1 million ransom that his kidnappers were demanding. After that, the caller told Miss Small not to call the police, but, of course, she did report it to the police, and soon they had put tracers on the family's telephone line to try and track down where the calls were coming from. Later in the afternoon, the person called the Smalls' residence again and asked how much of the ransom had been collected. Police were able to track this call from a gas station in Aroma Park. Less than an hour later, Stephen's aunt, Jean Alice Small, received a phone call saying that they knew that the phone line at Stephen's house had been tapped, and they also told her that Stephen had been buried and threatened to kill Jean's husband. Later that night, Nancy received another phone call from the kidnapper, and this call was traced to a different gas station in the same area as the first. During that call, the kidnapper played a recording of Stephen's voice detailing how to deliver the ransom. After the police did their enhancement of the audio, another voice was detected in the background, and it was threatening Stephen. Now, unknown to the kidnappers, an FBI agent saw a man making a phone call at a payphone at that gas station. With that man that made the phone call was a blonde-haired female. And the car they were traveling in was traced back to a woman named Nancy Risch, and it just so happened that Nancy Risch had blonde hair. The man that she had been seen with was believed to be her boyfriend, and his name's Danny Edwards. Someone had also seen these same two people at the other gas station that the afternoon phone call had been traced to. About 20 minutes later, Miss Small received one last phone call, and this call was traced to a gas station in Kankakee. The caller made accusations that Miss Small had called the police and went on to say that they would not be accepting the offer of the ransom. And not long after the caller disconnected the call, a police officer spotted Risch's car, and the trunk was partially opened. The car was driving from Kankakee in the direction of Aroma Park, so they decided to set up surveillance on Edwards' house. Officers saw a dark-colored car with the trunk partially opened arrive at the home. Edwards and Risch got out of the car and entered the home. Later that day, officers searched the house, and both Edwards and Risch were placed under arrest. And on that same day, Edwards led authorities to where Stephen had been buried. Once they were there, officers dug up a 6 feet by 3 feet wooden box. Along with Stephen's body, the box contained a light that had been connected to a car battery, a gallon jug of water, candy bars, and a flashlight. Now, to me, it's so odd to provide someone that you're burying alive with light and food and water. So maybe just that it was that the kidnappers hadn't in the beginning intended on killing Stephen. It's just odd. I've never heard of anything like that. But now, after the autopsy was performed, it was found that Stephen had survived for only about 3 or 4 hours after being placed in that box. And the cause of death was determined to be asphyxiation caused by suffocation. The kidnappers had placed a tube leading out of the box to above ground so that he could get air. But the length of that tube, or that pipe, was too long for the diameter of it, so it was basically useless. When Edwards went to trial, more damning evidence was thrown at Edwards and Risch. Around midnight, on the night that Smalls was kidnapped, a neighbor heard Edwards say, "Let's go, let's hit it," and then heard him get into the car and drive away. Now, previously, several neighbors had seen Edwards building that wooden box in the garage. And when they asked him about that box, he told them that several different stories. One was that he had told neighbors that it was for a lemonade stand. And he told another neighbor that he was building it for his brother to use. Now, 2 neighbors of the Smalls family saw a van that matched one that Edwards owned parked in the neighborhood sometime shortly after midnight on the night that he was kidnapped. A lot of other evidence was found in the home that Risch and Edwards shared, including a Kankakee phone book with the name Small circled. At the end of the trial, Edwards was found guilty of first-degree murder and aggravated kidnapping. At his sentencing hearing, he was found eligible for the death penalty. Risch had also been charged with first-degree murder and aggravated kidnapping. There was no direct evidence tying her to the murder or kidnapping, but the prosecution did have 8 inconsistent statements from Risch that they admitted into evidence in court. Risch was found guilty of both of those counts, and she was sentenced to life in prison, plus a 30-year concurrent sentence. 15 years later, the new governor at that time of Illinois, his name is George Ryan, he had actually been a neighbor of Stephen Small. At some point, he said that when Stephen was a teenager, he would, or a kid maybe, he would cut the grass, at his home. He had also babysat Ryan's kids. But when Ryan came into office, he commuted all death row sentences to life in prison. And that included Danny Edwards. And then in another shocking twist to the story, in February of this year, Nancy Risch was released from prison. Earlier that month, a judge had cut Risch's life sentence to 70 years with the possibility of parole. And this came about when her lawyers asked to have her sentence reduced based on a change in a state law that took place in 2015. That law allows those who have committed felonies to oppose their sentences if they can prove that their crimes were linked to them being the victim of domestic abuse. Well, Risch was able to prove that, and she was released shortly afterwards at the age of 60. The family of Stephen Small, they weren't opposed to her early release either. But Edwards is now 62 years old and still in prison serving his sentence. This story, it freaks me out too. I mean, this man thought that a property he owned was being, or had been, burglarized. He left his home to go there, but he was kidnapped at gunpoint. And he probably all along thought that he would be freed after his wife got the ransom money together, and probably continued to think that when he first went into that wooden box, because that box had been, filled with some candy and water and light and a tube that he thought he probably could get air through. And I'm sure soon after he was put in the ground in that box, the panic started to set in though. You know how it is when you start to panic and you can't breathe properly. It had to be so terrifying, y'all. It's just horrible to think about. And I did find a few cases of people being buried alive, but it was intentional. In 2010, a man from Russia died after being buried alive, and he had himself buried alive because he thought it would help him get over his fear of death. And then there's Mr. Beast. I'm sure y'all have heard of him. He's the famous YouTuber guy. He had himself buried alive for 50 freaking hours. And the whole thing was filmed and documented. I believe those videos are still on YouTube. And Mr. Beast, though, he was in this glass coffin with some blankets, a pillow, and of course a camera, because you can't document without a camera, right? But he did have an air ventilation system and walkie-talkie in the coffin, so he did go about it safely. But y'all, I'm sorry, even with that ventilation system and a walkie-talkie, there is no way in hell y'all find me doing the same thing. I don't even want to be buried when I'm dead. Alright, before I end this episode, I want to make another plea. I wish I could say I have an update, but I don't yet. Alexis Ware is still missing. There's a lot of theories floating around about what happened to her. There's so much hearsay, but the bottom line is this, y'all. Alexis is still missing. Alexis has 2 kids that are missing their mama. Somebody somewhere knows something. She didn't just vanish into thin air. I am literally begging you from the bottom of my heart. If you know something, please speak up. I mean, this could be your mom, your daughter, your sister, your cousin, your friend. Now, I don't personally know Alexis, but I have felt this deep connection to this case since I first read about it. Now, I hope that there is soon a break in this case, and I hope it's sooner rather than later. But in the meantime, if you have any information, no matter how insignificant that you think it is, please give the Anderson County Sheriff's Office a call, and you can reach them at 864-260-4405. Again, that number is 864-260-4405. Or you can call Crime Stoppers at 1-888-CRIME-SC. Let's bring Alexis home. Well, y'all, that's all I have for tonight. I appreciate you listening in.